Long ago, in the blazing heart of ancient Egypt, a ruler sat on a throne of gold. His word built cities, his hand moved armies, his name was spoken as though it were a god's. But even kings must face the end, and when death came for him, his priests and builders swore that his power would not fade with his last breath. They carved a tomb that stretched like a city beneath the sand. Corridors twisted and turned for miles. Chambers were filled with gold, weapons, chariots, statues, and scrolls written in a language of stars. At the very center, under layers of stone, the pharaoh lay in his coffin, his face covered with a mask of hammered gold. This was not only a resting place, it was a fortress. The builders laid traps in the floors and ceilings, hidden blades, false doors, and stairways that led to pits. They drew curses on the walls, lines of words said to burn the souls of intruders. They sealed jars of dark oil and locked them behind the stones. Rituals whispered over each one to keep strangers away. And when the last stone was placed and the last worker carried out, the entrance vanished under the desert. Sand rolled over the door like water. The wind erased the footprints. The priests died, and with them went the map to the tomb. Years became centuries. Centuries became thousands of years. Dynasties rose and fell. Cities grew and crumbled. The tomb slept under a sea of dunes. People walked over it without knowing. Stories faded into rumors, and rumors faded into silence. For 3,000 years, no human eye saw what lay within. Gold dulled in the dark. Linen turned to dust. The air itself grew heavy and still, sealed since the age of pyramids. But silence cannot last forever. Somewhere on the edge of a forgotten village, a farmer's son would one day swing a pick into the earth and hear it ring against stone. He would scrape away sand and feel a cold draft on his skin, and without knowing it, he would stand at the threshold of a world hidden for 3 millennia, a world that had been waiting for him all along. Far from the noise of the royal cities, beyond the reach of palace guards and temple bells, lay a quiet village pressed against the edge of the desert. Mud brick houses leaned against each other like tired shoulders. Goats picked at dry grass. The sun rose hard and unkind, and when it set, the sky burned red before giving way to the cold stars. In this small place lived a farmer's son named Cahiel. His hands were already rough, though he was barely a man. At dawn, he carried water from a cracked well. At dusk, he guided his father's plow across stubborn soil. The world expected him to live and die in the same handful of dust as his father had and his father before him. But there was a restlessness in him. When others kept their heads down, Cahiel kept his eyes on the horizon. He saw patterns in the dunes, strange shapes after a sandstorm, stones with carvings that did not belong to the village. At night, when the fires burned low, he listened to the old men tell half-forgotten tales of a hidden city swallowed by the desert, of a king whose name had been cut from every record. The elders spoke in whispers, afraid the words might wake something. They warned of curses, of doors that should never be opened. But to Cahiel, the stories were not warnings. They were a promise. Somewhere under the sand lay more than dry soil and old bones. Somewhere was a door, and he was certain it was waiting for him. One morning after a storm, he walked beyond the grazing fields to where the dunes rose like frozen waves. There, at the edge of a dry gully, he saw a shard of stone jutting from the sand. It bore a line of symbols he could not read, but felt he had seen before in dreams. The wind moaned through the cracks as though the desert itself was speaking. He touched the stone and felt a shiver run through his palm. It was colder than the air around it. Something beneath his feet was older than his village, older than his bloodline, and though he could not name it yet, Cahiel had found the first clue to a secret buried for 3,000 years. The sun was already high when Cahiel led the donkey out to the dry edge of the field. His father had asked him to dig a new channel for water, but the earth there was stubborn, packed with stones. Each strike of his pick sent up a puff of hot dust. Sweat rolled down his face, stinging his eyes. Hour after hour he worked, his mind wandering to the strange stone he had seen days before. The old stories flickered at the edges of his thoughts, curses, hidden chambers, kings buried with gold, all nonsense, the elders would say. Yet the sand seemed to shift differently here, as if it covered something more than soil. His pick struck again, and this time it rang, not the dull thud of rock, but a clear hollow note, like striking a drum. He froze. The donkey flicked its ears and stepped back. Slowly, he brushed away the sand with his hands. Beneath the dust lay smooth stone, pale and fitted with precision no farmer could afford. He scraped harder, coughing as the wind whipped grit into his mouth. A shape emerged, the edge of a block, then another, forming what looked like a seam. At the corner, faint carvings caught the sunlight, lines and curves, worn but still sharp enough to suggest figures, animals, and eyes staring back at him from a forgotten age. Cahill's heartbeat quickened. He glanced over his shoulder, but no one had followed him. The village was a distant blur beyond the dunes. Alone, he pressed his ear to the stone. The air leaking from the crack was cool, almost cold. With trembling fingers, he widened the gap, prying loose a chunk of brittle mortar. A sliver of darkness opened before him, blacker than any shade the desert could cast. From inside came a faint scent, not rot, not damp, but something old, metallic, and heavy. For an instant, he thought he saw a glint, as if light had struck gold far within. He staggered back, sand sliding under his feet. His breath came fast. This was no ordinary ruin. He had found a door that time itself had forgotten, and it was no longer completely closed. Word of Cahill's find spread through the small village faster than a sandstorm. Old men spat into the dust and crossed their arms. Women drew charms in the air. Do not disturb the dead, they warned. The Pharaoh's curse waits for the fool who breaks his sleep. Even his own father begged him to fill the hole and forget what he had seen, but the stone in the ground pulled at Cahill's thoughts like a tide. He lay awake at night, hearing the hollow ring of his pick, feeling the cool breath from the crack. In the darkness behind his eyelids, the glint of gold flashed like lightning. At dawn, he rose without speaking and gathered tools: a heavier pick, a chisel, a coil of rope, an oil lamp. A single friend, a boy from the next field, followed him in silence. Together they returned to the site, the donkey's hooves crunching on salt-white sand. When Cahill struck the wall this time, the sound was deeper. The seam widened. Chips of ancient mortar fell away, exposing carved figures with arms raised, eyes painted in faded black. The hieroglyphs curled around them like snakes. His friend hesitated, muttering a prayer, but Cahill's hands were steady. He drove the chisel into the gap. Stone cracked. A breath of air escaped the tomb, cool and sharp, carrying a scent like burned resin. The lamp flame trembled, though there was no wind. From inside came a low sound, a settling of rock, or perhaps something else moving far away. They squeezed through the opening into a passage narrow as a throat. Sand shifted underfoot. Above, the ceiling groaned. Loose stones fell and shattered at their feet. The walls were covered in painted warnings. Wings of black birds, blades dripping red. In the flicker of the lamp, the figures almost seemed to move. A hidden step gave way, and the boy's foot plunged into a hole. Cahill caught him by the arm and dragged him back, heart hammering. The passage twisted and split like a puzzle. Dead ends led to pits. Symbols on the walls pointed one way, then another. Still, Cahill pushed on. Every danger only sharpened his will. Whatever waited ahead had slept for 3,000 years, and now it was watching him come closer. The last corridor narrowed until Cahill could feel stone on both shoulders. The air grew heavier, tasting of ash and old incense. Each step sent a faint echo racing ahead of him, as though the passage were whispering his arrival to something waiting beyond. His lamp flickered, casting frantic shapes across walls carved with rows of eyes. Then, ahead, the darkness opened. A final slab blocked his way, marked by a sun disk and two serpents coiled in a knot. Beneath it, an inscription glowed faintly, not with paint, but with some mineral catching the lamp's light. His friend's voice trembled. "This is the last door. We should stop." Cahill pressed his palm to the stone. It was cold, colder than the air, and it hummed faintly as if a heartbeat behind it. He wedged his chisel into the seam and hammered until his arms ached. With a long groan, the slab shifted, dust falling like dry snow. A gap opened, a wind poured out that smelled of cedar and something sweet and bitter all at once. They stepped inside. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows, pillars carved as lions rose around them, their eyes inlaid with gemstones that caught the lamplight like living pupils. On the floor lay relics older than any script Cahill had ever seen. Scrolls sealed in resin, blades of strange metal, tablets etched with stars and lines like maps of the sky. This was no treasury. It was a vault of knowledge, a library hidden in a tomb. Symbols on the walls showed not funerals, but machines, rivers bent from their courses, a man crowned by fire. The air vibrated softly like a low chant. Then the light shifted. Between two pillars, a shape formed, not stone, not flesh. A tall figure draped in gold dust stood where nothing had been. Its face was a mask of the dead king, eyes dark and endless. The lamp flame bent toward it as if pulled. Cahill's breath caught. He understood then the stories of guardians were not superstition. Whatever the Pharaoh had bound to protect his rest was here awake and aware of them. Cahill's hands shook as he lifted a single relic from the floor, a tablet no bigger than his arm, carved with stars and words he couldn't read. The moment it left its pedestal, the chamber shuddered like a beast waking. Dust rained from the ceiling. The jeweled eyes of the lion pillars flared with cold light. A low moan rose from the walls, a sound too deep to be wind. Symbols he had not touched began to glow, curling around the room in lines of fire. His friend cried out as the figure between the pillars moved, its mask tilting. Shadows stretched from its feet, reaching across the floor like fingers. "Run," Cahill hissed. They turned toward the door, but the passage had changed. The straight corridor they had entered now twisted, splitting into three. The lamp flickered wildly, throwing warped images of snakes and claws onto the stone. The air itself seemed to spin, carrying the stench of burning resin and rot. They sprinted left only to find a dead end where there had been open space. Behind them came a cracking sound, the floor splitting. Sand poured from the ceiling, filling the corridor like water. Rats, pale and blind, spilled from hidden holes, scrambling over their feet as they ran. Cahill clutched the tablet to his chest and forced himself to breathe. He remembered the symbols he had seen on the wall earlier, arrows curling around a sun disk. With a shaking hand, he traced the pattern on a nearby stone. A section of wall groaned and slid aside just as the ceiling above collapsed, crushing the path behind them. They plunged through the opening. Darkness swallowed them, then a dim light ahead. But the specter's voice followed, a hiss like sand sliding over bone. Shapes flickered at the edge of the lamp's glow, hands reaching, eyes blinking in the walls themselves. One final passage rose before them, its floor cracked and shifting. They leapt gaps, ducked falling stones, and burst through a last narrow slit of rock. A rush of cold night air hit their faces. Behind them, the entrance roared shut, sealing the tomb once more. The desert swallowed the sound. Only Cahill's ragged breathing and the weight of the tablet reminded him he had not dreamed it. The corridor trembled like a living thing as Cahill clawed his way forward, clutching the scroll tight to his chest. The sand was rising now, hissing against his skin, filling his boots and choking the torchlight. Somewhere behind, stone cracked like thunder. The roar of falling chambers rolled through the tomb like the growl of an angry god. A jagged beam of daylight flickered ahead. The final shaft, the one he had marked hours earlier, was barely recognizable under the collapse. The stone mouth had narrowed to a cruel slit, already filling with debris. He lunged, scraping his hands raw as he pulled himself upward. His shoulder hit the rock. He shoved harder, every muscle screaming. A sound like 1,000 wings rose from the dark below. The Pharaoh's specter, vast and half-formed, clawed toward him from the dust, its eyes two burning suns of gold. It did not speak, but its presence pressed on his chest, crushing breath, demanding surrender. No! Cahill rasped, dragging the scroll higher. With one last heave, he rolled through the gap, tumbling onto blistering sand. The sun struck him like a hammer after the tomb's gloom. He gasped, blinking at the endless desert. Behind him, the entrance convulsed. Stones slid and locked like teeth. Then the entire mound sagged inward, vanishing beneath a storm of dust. Within seconds, there was nothing but a shallow depression in the dunes. The tomb had sealed itself, swallowing its guardians and illusions once more. Cahill knelt, coughing, the scroll still clutched in his hands. Its seal, a single eye within a sun disk, glimmered faintly, untouched by sand. Proof of what lay hidden beneath, proof that he had not been mad to search. In the shimmering distance, a caravan crested a dune. Voices called out, boots thudding across the sand. Strong hands lifted him upright. He tried to speak, but only pointed back to where the tomb had been. There was nothing to see but the wind moving over empty dunes. As they led him away, the scroll's weight seemed to grow heavier, as though the tomb's spirit still clung to it. Behind his closed eyes, he could still see the glowing inscriptions, words that could rewrite history, and the burning gaze of the specter watching him leave. Cahill returned to the village under a sun as harsh as judgment, but he was no longer the nameless farmer's son who had plowed the dry earth. Word of his survival and of the sealed scroll in his possession spread faster than the desert wind. Traders carried whispers to the nearest city. By the week's end, officials and scholars were arriving at his doorstep, eyes burning with curiosity and suspicion. The scroll was displayed under heavy cloth in a clay jar, its seal untouched. Some called it a relic. Others called it stolen property, an offense to the gods and the ancestors. The local temple demanded it return to the sands. The provincial governor demanded it for the capital. Cahill found himself at the center of a storm he could not control. For every hand that praised him, another pointed an accusing finger. Archaeologists begged him to reveal the tomb's exact location. Priests muttered about curses now unleashed. Even his neighbors looked at him with a mixture of awe and unease, as though a shadow still clung to him. At night he lay awake, staring at the scroll. The inscriptions haunted him. He could still hear the Pharaoh's specter in his dreams. A silent demand to protect what had been hidden for 3,000 years. Had he saved the tomb's legacy or betrayed it? Officials called him to hearings, merchants offered him fortunes, and yet he refused to reveal where the tomb had been. Perhaps he feared the curse, or perhaps he simply understood that the sands had claimed their secret again and would not give it up twice. By the year's end, the name Cahill was etched in newspapers and whispered in scholarly halls across the continent. Some hailed him as the man who broke the wall, a hero who brought history back to life. Others branded him a thief of the dead, a fool who tampered with sacred ground. And so he stood between two worlds. One of myth, one of modern intrigue, his hands still calloused from the plow, his eyes older than his years. The tomb's treasures were gone, sealed forever, but the questions he had awakened would outlive them all. Centuries passed, and the dunes shifted as they always had, bearing roads, swallowing villages, reshaping the land until no one could point to the place where Cahill once stood. His name drifted through time like a grain of sand, carried in old songs, whispered in desert markets, etched in fragments of forgotten manuscripts. Children heard tales of a farmer's son who challenged the dead and returned with a secret. Elders argued over whether he had been blessed or cursed. In the halls of universities far from the desert, scholars still gathered around cracked maps and faded scrolls. Some swore Cahill had opened a real tomb, the resting place of a pharaoh lost to history. Others dismissed it as folklore, a parable about greed and fate. Each generation produced new theories, new expeditions, and new debates. Yet the tomb itself, if it ever existed, lay hidden, its entrance swallowed by the endless shifting sands. Here and there, travelers reported odd sightings: a row of ancient stones half buried after a storm, a flicker of gold in a dune at sunset, hieroglyphs carved where no human hand should have reached. These hints were always fleeting, like ghosts, leaving no proof. But they were enough to keep the legend alive, and in the deepest part of the desert, where no caravan dares to go, there is said to be a hollow under the sand, vast chambers sealed by stones too heavy for time to move. Inside, a throne stands beneath a painted ceiling of stars. Beside it rests a spectral figure, silent, patient, eyes like twin suns. The pharaoh's spirit waits, neither fully asleep nor fully awake, bound to the relics and inscriptions meant to guard him for eternity. Some nights, when the wind howls across the dunes, it carries a sound like footsteps echoing through stone corridors, as though someone is still moving inside. The legend says it is Cahill himself, still wandering the labyrinth between life and death, or perhaps the pharaoh searching for the man who dared to break his wall. No one knows which part is truth, which is myth, but the desert remembers, and it keeps its secrets well.